All right. It is good to see everyone. Just first of all, a couple house cleaning issues. I'm going to be gone for the next 2 Wednesdays. Mike is going to be filling in for me and should be set up to cover chapter 5 over those 2 weeks. That's assuming that we get through chapter 4 this evening. Last Wednesday we ended where I wanted to end, so hopefully we can do that again this evening. So the next 2 Wednesdays, Mike is going to be taking over for me. We're going to be on the road, probably. Well, one of those at least. All right. So as we get into Galatians chapter 4, we are continuing the flow of thought from Galatians chapter 3. And we've really hit into the meat of his argumentation by this point. Last week we talked about some things that were probably relatively familiar. The idea, the discussion about the seed versus seeds that Paul brings up, where he says, what if we've been misunderstanding this? And the seed refers to the singular Jesus, the Christ, not the plural, that is the people of Israel. And then we talked about the concept of the child trainer. Some translations have schoolmaster, I think is what the King James. Some have guardian, and then some have tutor. And out of all of the possible translations, I think tutor's just about the absolute worst of those, as far as trying to gauge or get the proper idea of what the child trainer was all about. He was more than just somebody who stepped in and helped somebody because they were falling behind in their math. The child trainer was someone who was responsible for teaching all aspects of life and what it means to live in polite society. And so he was responsible not just for reading, writing, arithmetic, and those types of things, but how to be a man, how to engage in diplomacy, how to engage in the marketplace, how to handle money. All of these things would have been things that a person would have been assumed he knew before he enters into society. And when the father deems it's a good time for him to enter into society, he then is introduced to what's called the master teacher. And so the master teacher then takes over the rest of the training, what we would call probably college, graduate level type stuff. That's what the master teacher was responsible for. So all of this training is necessary, is it not? I mean, could somebody just step right to the master trainer, master teacher, and everything would be hunky-dory if he'd never learned all the other stuff? Can you walk into a college-level calculus class if you don't know how to add or subtract? No, right? And that's the idea, is that the law is really important. The law is not just a throwaway thing. It's kind of one of the reasons that I think tutor is a really bad translation, because people can get by without a tutor, right? You don't have to have a tutor in order to get through subjects. It might be helpful. And when people see that translation for the law of Moses, it causes them to say, well, the law of Moses, I mean, it was helpful, it was useful, it was nice, but it certainly wasn't necessary. Well, that's not at all the point Paul's making. It's absolutely necessary. There's a reason why it took so long for Jesus to come onto the scene. The law of Moses was very specifically given to this group of people so that they could prepare the world for and bring about the Messiah. Without the law being their child trainer, guardian, schoolmaster, the one that keeps them in, trains them, and therefore the rest of the world through them, who and what the Messiah is, there's no Messiah. It's meaningless. Everything about the new covenant is not separate and apart from the old covenant. It's built upon the old covenant. And without the old covenant, it is meaningless. It has no bearing in and of itself. So, why the law? What's the purpose of the law? Does God nullify the law if a Gentile is able to come to Christ without going through the law? Of course not. Christ is the fulfillment. He's the one that brings it all to its head. When they come to Christ, they're coming to the fulfillment of what the law and everything is. So, chapter 3, verse 27, for those of you who were baptized into Christ have been clothed with Christ. And there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female, since you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed, heirs according to the promise. Now, I say that as long as the heir is a child, he differs in no way from a slave, though he is the owner of everything. Instead, he's under the guardian and trustees until the time set by his father. In the same way, we also, when we were children, were in slavery under the elements of the world. When the time came to completion, God, or perhaps you have, when the fullness of time came, God sent his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God sent the Spirit of Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father, so that you are no longer a slave, but a son. If a son, then God has made you an heir. All right, so we talked, this is the section we finished on last week, and I just want to make sure to reiterate a couple points, and one thing that we didn't talk about, I want to make sure that we do. This is all about the completion of that child trainer's work, that at the time that has been appointed by the Father, he no longer is going to be under the child trainer. He's going to come out from that and go to the master teacher, but that's the point that he enters into life. Now, this says, when the fullness of time had come, or the CSB, it puts it, let's see here, when the time came to completion. I don't want to go too much into this, except to say you've probably heard before various reasons why that the first century was the fullness of time. Anybody heard these things about the fullness of time? That the Romans had a peace, that there were Roman roads for the spread of the gospel. There was a universal language at this point in time. Is this stuff you guys have heard before? You know, yeah, I don't think any of that has anything to do with this at all. If all of that were the case, today would have been the day that Jesus would have come. I mean, we're in what's called the information age. How can you get more better for all of this than today? You can travel around the world in just a few hours, right? You can get information from here to there with the snap of the fingers. That type of stuff, you know, I don't think that has anything to do with it. I think it's all about this one factor. That's the time God chose. That's all it was. That was the time that he chose. He said, this is the fullness of time. This was it. It was a moment that was chosen before the foundations of the world. It was a moment that was talked about really throughout. You see in Daniel, when you have the statue or the beast, you know, the beasts that were coming up out of the ocean, those things, it was just very specifically said, the time that you get to this when the Romans are in control, the fourth kingdom, then you will know, be searching for it, be looking for it. And the time came to its conclusion. Nothing to do at all, I don't think, with a Roman peace or Roman roads or Roman language or anything like that. It was kind of arbitrary. This is just the time that God had chosen, and it came to that point, so that now God sent a son born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem the ones under the law, to become, that they might receive adoption. What did we say that was interesting about that phrase? The ones who are under the law had to be what?
Adopted.
What's that?
Adopted.
Not adopted yet. They will be. Yes. All right, they first had to be redeemed. Right? To redeem those who are under the law. And it's not until they're redeemed, then, as Kelly says, so that they could be adopted as sons. But the idea that those who were, and this is getting what Kelly was saying, they are the natural children of Abraham, right? And yet, what Paul is saying is this whole system of redemption and sonship is outside of the law of Moses. It's outside of the nation of Israel, and even those who are in Israel require redemption, and they require adoption. However, is it only to those who are inside of Israel? The people of Israel, are they the only ones who get to receive redemption and adoption? All right, no, it's for all, and that's where we get into new material starting in verse 8. But in the past, since you didn't know God, you were enslaved to things that by nature are not God's. But now since you know God, or rather have become known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elements? Do you want to be enslaved to them all over again? You're observing special days, months, seasons, years. I am fearful for you that perhaps my labor for you has been wasted. All right, so let's talk about the you that you find right here. In the past, since you didn't know God, you were enslaved to things that by nature are not God's. What's he talking about? I'm sorry? Circumcision and the like. Well, not necessarily here. He has been up until this point, and I think he's making a shift at this point where he's turning from those things at the end of it, maybe. And maybe that's what you're keying in on, is the end of it. So we'll come back to what you said about circumcision in a moment, because I think it will be applicable there. But just this first phrase, in the past you didn't know God, you were enslaved to things that by nature are not God's. What's he talking about? Yeah, it's just a clear, verbose way of saying you served idols. And does he blame them for it? No, what does he say? Okay, yeah, they were enslaved, and they didn't what? They didn't know God. They had no relationship with God, because remember, God had his relationship with Israel. And how had Israel done in being a priest to all the other nations? Not a very good job, right? Kind of failed on that just a little bit. And so all the other nations are enslaved. And so that becomes a problem. He says, look, this is where you were. It makes sense. You didn't know God. You were enslaved to the things that by nature are not God's. You lived in idolatry. But are they still living in that idolatry? No. And this is one of the reasons why it's important to realize that Galatians is predominantly written to Jew or Gentile. Gentile. Whereas the message in Romans, when we get to that and talk about that, because there's a lot of carryover between the two, but it is predominantly written to Jew or Gentile. That one's predominantly written to Jew. And so we'll see the difference, that you find there. But the main you here in Galatians, he talks about these who lived in idolatry. They've now come to know God, or he says, even better, you've become known by God. And yet, what are they doing? Turning back to what?
Idolatry.
Is it?
Well, he talks about the weak and worthless elemental things for which you desire to be enslaved all over again. So it's something they were enslaved with before, and talk about how that was things that were by nature not God, so therefore here's to be a reference back to that, reference to idolatry.
Okay, so he talks about them in idolatry. But let's put this in the context of Galatians, right? Have we been talking about idolatry up to this point? Did Paul start out his letter saying, I can't believe that you are so quickly going back into idolatry? Okay, it has everything to do with these Judaizing teachers, right? So bear that in mind, Bruce.
Now, he calls them in the first part of the book, you foolish Galatians.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it's the foolish things that bring us to realize what true wisdom is. There's a lot of references in the Old Testament about folly and doing things that are foolish. And,
right.
So in this case, I think he's trying to establish that you don't have to go back to the old way of the Jews. You don't have to become a Jew first to become saved.
Okay, all right. So let's key in on what Bruce is saying right there, because I think Bruce is taking us exactly right down the right path. Goes to what Ryan said a second ago. The issue here are the Judaizing teachers. That's been the issue all along. And then Paul directs his attention to these Gentiles and says, y'all came out of idolatry. Why are you going back into idolatry? That sounds like what he's saying, right? Someone connect the dots for me. What is Paul doing here?
Apparently he's broadening his category in verse 9, weak and worthless elemental things.
I'm not sure that he is.
Do you think he is referring to idolatry?
No, not, well, sort of. Lorraine?
In verse 10, you observe days and months and seasons and years.
Okay.
That's the Mosaic law.
All right. Lorraine said in verse 10, you observe days and months and seasons and years. That is from the Mosaic law. I think she's absolutely right. Kelly?
If an idol is anything that we put before God or in place of God, are they making going through the law of Moses an idol? Because you have to go through them to get to God.
Yeah, it seems to me as if what is happening here, remember our little funnel, right? That you have the law of Moses and you have poor Mr. Gentile, that the Judaizing teachers would say you have to come through here. Paul says, nope, you can just come straight to the cross. If they pick all of this up as well, then what does that become to them?
They're enslaved to it, in Paul's words.
Okay, they're enslaved to it, and it becomes what? I mean, it's what Kelly just said. It's what? It's idolatry. The law of Moses itself becomes a system of idolatry that a Gentile enters into when they enter into it to have anything at all to do with their justification and their standing before God. Kelly, Bruce has got his hand up over there. Yeah, go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, the observance of days and months and seasons was the celebration that many of the Jews had when they celebrated the Feast of Booths and all of these other feasts and celebrations that they had on a regular basis.
Right.
And so what he's saying is you don't have to go back to that to be saved.
Yeah. And what he's saying, it's not that he's saying you don't have to go back to the law of Moses. And I think it's important that we understand that. That's a message from Hebrews, right? Everybody remember that? You don't need to go back to the law of Moses if you're a Jewish Christian. That's Hebrews. We're not in Hebrews. And so we need to make sure we're careful with our terminology. He's not saying you don't have to go back to the law of Moses. He's saying that you can't go back to what? It's on the board. Rhymes with idolatry? Idolatry. Very good, Kelly. Excellent. Yes. All right. He says you can't go back to idolatry. And for a Gentile, the law of Moses, or you could say Judaism, is idolatry. Does that make sense? That's the equation that he's making right here. That for a Gentile, now is this for a Jew that he's referring to? No, because for the Jews, for Israel, this is their system. This is what they live under. And there's nothing that says that they have to come out of that in order to become a Christian. It's not mutually exclusive with Christianity because it's just a part of their personal system that they live under. But I will say the minute that they begin to treat the Judaic law of Moses system in a way that creates justification before God, then it becomes idolatry to them as well. Ryan?
I have a question I've been kind of chewing on for the last couple of days, kind of thinking about this class. So, did the Galatians have the book of John?
No.
No, they wouldn't have had the book of John. Okay. That answers my question, because I was trying to think, how could they still be Judaizing teachers when John 1:15 says, out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given, for the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ.
Yeah. And at this point, they're still working their way through a lot of these ideas. And Paul is laying this out for them. This is one of the earliest, if it's not the earliest, of the writings. James might be earlier, but if James isn't earlier, this is the earliest writing from the New Testament. So we're seeing very early stuff, less than 20 years, I would say, from the crucifixion itself. So they're still working through some of these ideas. At least in my timeline, the Gospel of John won't be for another probably 40 years or so. So there's a lot of maturity in the church that's going to take place before then. So for them, the law of Moses becomes a system of idolatry when they go to it and use it in order to try to have a relationship with God. Because what is the only means of a relationship with God that exists at this point now? All right, Jesus. And that is by what? All right, yep. So that comes by faith in Jesus Christ. Or as he says elsewhere, as Kelly quoted, by grace through faith. All right, so through verse 11 then, what we see is that he is telling these individuals that for them to go into the law of Moses, that is the same as idolatry for them. And so he says in verse 12, I beg you, brothers and sisters, become like me, for I have become like you. You've not wronged me. You know that previously I preached the gospel to you because of a weakness of the flesh. You did not despise or reject me, though my physical condition was a trial for you. On the contrary, you received me as an angel of God, as Christ Jesus himself. Where then is your blessing? For I testify to you that if possible, you would have torn out your eyes and given them to me. So then have I become your enemy because I told you the truth? They court you eagerly, but not for good. They want to exclude you from me so that you would not pursue them. So that you would pursue them. But it is always good to be pursued in a good manner and not just when I'm with you. My children, I am again suffering labor pains for you until Christ is formed in you. I would like to be with you right now and change my tone of voice because I don't know what to do about you. All right, so all of this is still directed at what group of people?
Judaizing teachers.
Well, this one isn't at the Judaizing teachers. That's going to come, and Michael talked about that in chapter 5, what he thinks about those people. In chapter 5 and verse 12 there, that you kind of get his thoughts about the Judaizing teachers. This is still to whom, though? He's still talking to those Gentile Christians who have been hoodwinked into going back into idolatry, right? Not going back to the law of Moses because they didn't have it before. They're going back into idolatry through the law of Moses. That they've turned the law of Moses into idolatry for them. And you can see here, anxiety, I think, might be the word that really encapsulates this section right here. Because what does he remind them of? He starts off this section reminding them of what? What's that, Ryan? Did you say, I hear?
Are you still in chapter 4?
Yeah, chapter 4, starting verse 12 through 20.
So he's talking about Hagar. Oh, no. 12?
No.
A little bit further down, he's talking about Hagar versus Sarah.
Oh, we're not down there yet.
Okay.
No, what does he say? Verse 13.
Verse 13, he says, as you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. And even though my illness was a trial to you, you did not treat me with contempt or scorn. Instead, you welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Christ Jesus himself.
All right, so what's he reminding them of? Okay, how they treated him when? Yeah, when he first arrived, when he first presented what to them? When he first presented the message of the gospel. Did they have any problems with Paul then? Did they have any issues? Was he their enemy at that point in time? No, they were bending over backwards for him. And he talks about this, I didn't look at the Greek on this, the weakness of the flesh. Some of you guys have illness, I guess. Connie mentioned the thorn in the flesh, which is very, very often brought up with this section, especially when he says, you would have torn your own eyes out for me, and say, well, Paul his thorn in the flesh must have had something to do with his eyes. And yeah, I don't think this has anything at all to do with what he calls his thorn in the flesh. I'm just going to take a moment to reiterate what I believe Paul tells us his thorn in the flesh is, fairly definitively, that it is his weaknesses in chapter 11 of 2 Corinthians. How his persecutions, how he was beaten, stoned, flogged, received lashes, and then, night and the day, in the deep, and all of that stuff. That contextually is what Paul tells us is the thorn in the flesh. I'm glad you brought that up, Connie, because this is, by and large, I've used it. For most of my life, I've used this passage as saying, yeah, this is probably what Paul's thorn in the flesh is. And it probably had something to do with his eyes, and I guess we'll never know, unless you actually look at the context of 2 Corinthians, and you're like, oh, okay, well, that makes sense. But there was obviously something going on, some kind of ailment of some sort, in which they bent over backwards to help him out. They developed a relationship by taking care of him. They had fondness for him. They had love for him. They would have done anything for him. Is it still the same? No. How do they regard him now? You can tell by the objection that he raises here. All right, yeah, Lorraine says, verse 16, have I become your enemy now? And I think it's important we say, have I become your enemy because I've told you the truth? That's the way they now view him. That's the way they look at him, that he, when he came in, didn't tell them everything, that he's hiding stuff from them, he's not giving them the full gospel. These Judaizing teachers have come in as their saviors, they're telling them everything that they need to know, and they're ostracizing this Paul, who comes in, who's this rogue person that you can't trust. And Paul's like, seriously? Have you totally forgotten the relationship that we shared when I was there among you? He's like, you've just done a complete 180 here. And it ought not to be that way. Yeah, Bruce?
He goes on to say, have you forgot the blessings that are in Christ? Mm-hmm. And then he continues on down and he says, he doesn't know what to do with them. He's kind of frustrated and a little bit aggravated because he doesn't know now how to go about bringing them to a full understanding of the blessings of Christ.
Yeah, very good. And we'll hit that in just a second. I want to talk about verse 17 first, though. What's going on, apparently, from verse 17? You got to follow the pronouns here a little bit, but figure those out. But what's going on? Who's the they to start off verse 17? All right, this is the Judaizing teachers. He says, they court you eagerly. That is, they're coming to you, and they're doting on you, and they're spending a lot of time with you, and they're being Mr. Helpful to you. To what end? What's that? Okay, yes. They said they court you eagerly, but not for what? All right, it's not for good. All right, the end is not good. The thing is, they want to keep you from me. They want to drive a wedge between me and the gospel that I've taught. And they want to separate us. Alienate, is that the word that you have there, Ryan? And yeah, they want to alienate you from me. In other words, they want to put this wedge between us, vilify me, make me out to be the bad guy here. And he says, you know better than this. I spend time with you. You don't hate me. You love me. You would have given your eyes for me. He says, how could this have possibly changed so quickly? He's like, I kind of get it, verse 18. It's nice to know that you're wanted, that people care about you, people are coming in. It's nice that you're receiving this attention. And so it's always good to be pursued, but in a good manner. he says, not just when I'm with you, my children, I am again. What? Verse 19? In the anguish of childbirth, is that what you said? I'm in the anguish of childbirth. I'm suffering labor pains. How's that possible? He's a guy, right? Okay, Josie just said, does this connect back to Genesis 3? You might be able to make some type of connection. I like the way you're thinking. I don't know if there's a clear, overt connection there, but ponder it and come back to me with it if you can find a really good connection. I like the thought. Yeah, Kelly?
They're his spiritual kids, and he gave birth to them.
Okay.
Into Christ, not that, you know what I mean. And now he's like, I don't know what to do.
He says, I'm again suffering the labor pains until what? Until Christ is formed in you. In other words, yes, a birth of sorts has taken place, but he's saying that this labor anxiety that you have, the labor, the pains of labor is what he says. But, if you want to go to what Josie's talking about, connect it back to Genesis 3:16, which, I could spend a little time telling you how it's not about physical pain, but the anxiety of that. But we've covered that. We've talked about that already, right? To quite an extent. Yeah. Does that end immediately if you're a parent? No, because there's maturity that still needs to take place. And as children are maturing, there's that constant sense of anxiety that what? What are you scared of? What were you scared of, for those of you who maybe it's been a while since you were a parent? Kelly?
That my children will either not love God or will stop loving God.
Okay. Yeah. That what should be formed in them will not be formed. Right? I mean, that's the fear, that they won't reach that point. And so he says, look, you guys have sent me all the way back to labor pains right now. You've sent me all the way back to the beginning where I'm wondering, are you even going to make it? Because if you follow after these guys up here, you're not going to make it. They're leading you into idolatry. And tell me, you who want to be under the law, don't you listen to the law? For it's written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave, the other by a free woman. But the one by the slave was born as a result of the flesh. The one by the free woman was born through promise. These things are being taken figuratively, for the women represent two covenants. One is Mount Sinai, bears the children into slavery. This is Hagar. Now Hagar represents Mount Sinai in Arabia and corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free. She is our mother. For it is written, rejoice, childless woman, unable to give birth. Burst into song and shout, you who are not in labor, for the children of the desolate woman will be many more numerous than those of the woman who has a husband. Now you too, brothers and sisters, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as then the child born as a result of the flesh persecuted the one born as a result of the Spirit, so also now. But what does the Scripture say? Drive out the slave and her son, for the son of the slave will never be a co-heir with the one of the free woman. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we are not children of a slave, but of the free woman. All right. So, I tried to time this where I wouldn't have much time with this. No, we still have 4 minutes, right? We let out oh, that clock is slow. Man, I've been going by that clock, and yeah, we need to adjust that thing, because, yeah, we still got like 4 minutes. All right. All right, very quickly then. I thought I had more time. Why is this analogy or this allegory between Hagar and Sarah, why is this so messed up for a Jew to hear? Who does he attribute the Jews to? Sarah or Hagar? Hagar. That she represents the one who has the fleshly advantage because Ishmael was born first, right? And so maybe the fleshly advantage goes there, but the spiritual advantage, the one that really matters, the one of promise, comes through Isaac. And he says, yeah, you know, Israel, they have the fleshly advantage, but that doesn't mean anything when it comes right down to it, because there is the true Israel, and we were going to talk about the remnant and how the remnant comes out to form the true Israel. And by the way, this isn't always the picture, right? Paul has the right to change the way that he describes things from time to time. And then you have Gentiles over here who also join in to be the true Israel. And he says, this is the spiritual Jerusalem. And what happens in the story? What happens to Isaac? What does Ishmael do? Y'all remember? He kind of supplants him in some way, right? He laughs, is what it says. And anyway, we don't need to go into why that matters. But there's a sense in which he supplants, or he tries to supplant. He persecutes, he challenges the promised heir. And they said, yeah, you should expect that. That's what Israel is doing to Christians right now, right? Whether it be Jews outside, or even, as Paul's talking about right here, Jewish Christians inside who are saying, no, you have to abide by this, and if you don't, we will come upon you and persecute you and challenge you. He says it shouldn't be surprising. That's the way that it happens from the very beginning of their history, and that's what's taking place now. But when it comes right down to it, this needs to be driven away. Don't allow this element to focus on what you do over here. Get this out. This has nothing at all to do with your salvation as a Gentile. You come directly to Christ through the true spiritual family. You are a true spiritual heir. As you had the faith of Abraham, you are a son of Abraham. You are an heir according to the promise, something that the physical Israel cannot claim just by their physical lineage. All right, everybody got that? That takes us through chapter 4. Mike's going to pick up in chapter 5 next week. If you have any more questions about it, I know I didn't give it a ton of time. We can always talk later, but I do want Mike to be able to move on next week. So, thanks a lot, guys. And it says 7:45, by the way, on the clock right now. So just pointing that out.